There's no question that there's an unprecedented public conversation and concern about sexual harassment going on.
It's a watershed moment.
Stop the violence, stop the rape! Stop the violence, stop the rape!
There's still a long way to go. NBC News actively covered up Harvey Weinstein's abuse of women.
I urge all of us to not only support survivors and bystanders who are brave enough to tell their truth, but to promote restorative justice.
It's time to get Al off the bench.
What started as a simple exchange of empathy between survivors has now become a rallying cry, a movement builder.
What he was effectively telling me while he held my genitals in his hand was that he held the power.
All around the world, there are workers in every industry with a powerful person potentially threatening them and with not enough accountability to stop that.
Goodness, well, we have a lot to get through. Our question is, what is wrong with men? If I'd been framing the question, I would have said, what the hell is wrong with men? But what an extraordinary day to be having this conversation with this extraordinary panel, given the news yesterday that Les Moonves was finally let go from CBS. I think so. And the 5 most frightening words, I think, in the English language now for any CEO must be, hello, this is Ronan Farrow. Can you imagine? And also, all those men out there, and some women too, because we don't want to pretend that it's only men that bully. Imagine knowing that that phone call might be coming. Quite extraordinary. Anyway, we have an unbelievable panel to talk about this with the broadcaster Amanda Parris, Michael Ian Black, author, comedian, and actually wrestling with a book called, what's your book called? Just tell everybody the title.
A Better Man.
A Better Man, so we'll come back to that and test him. But I think he deserves a round of applause for actually being here. A white man. Mira Sorvino, of course, Oscar-winning actress, and of course you launched or you premiered Mighty Aphrodite, for which you won the Oscar here in Toronto, right?
I did, yes.
1996, and an astonishing campaigner for Me Too, as is Amber Tamblyn, the actor, author, and poet. Mira, I want to start with you because you were one of the first people that came out with Ronan Farrow talking about Harvey Weinstein. I wanted to ask you about your year. What's it been like?
My year has been tumultuous, painful, triumphal, all of the above. I think it was a good move for me personally to make the decision to be honest about my experiences with Harvey. And then to join the forces of leagues of other women and men who are survivors in the Me Too and Time's Up movements. And, you know, I have been a Goodwill ambassador for the United Nations on human trafficking since 2009, and I've come to realize in my activism career that activism means nothing if it's not, awareness means nothing if it's not coupled with action. So I've tried to take my ability to speak to you all about sexual assault, harassment, abuse, rape, and turn it into something positive and measurable by getting behind legislation. So this spring and winter, actually, we started something called #TakeTheLead, where we were fostering 3 bills for California, actually 4, but 3 have passed. They're the strongest slate of anti-sexual harassment bills in the nation. They are concerning the statute of limitations, lengthening it from 1 to 3 years, which is still not enough. Those survivors, would, like myself, would like to see no statute on harassment, but it's a start. Redefining the definition of who can be a harasser. So in this gig economy, it doesn't have to be directly the person who hired you. In Los Angeles and California, in my business, we're the ultimate gig economy. There's so many different people who are involved in your place of work. It doesn't have to just be the producer or the studio. It could be your director, a casting agent, your agent, any number of people in your workplace who could be guilty of sexual harassment. We're also ending the one grope rule. There's a ridiculous, arcane rule on the books that says a man can squeeze a woman's breast once at work, and that's not considered harassment.
Oh, it's unbelievable, isn't it? Unbelievable.
Yeah, it is truly unbelievable.
And how many times are we allowed to squeeze them? Just remind me.
I don't know. I don't know. But ask
them?
Terry Crews, because it affected him the same way. But another thing that most people aren't aware is that in many employment contracts, employers unscrupulously will put in a clause getting the person to sign away their ability to sue for sexual harassment. And often it's wrapped up in an advancement or a bonus. And then when these people actually do have a situation where they say, wait a second, I've been sexually harassed, what can I do? They are told, oh, you've actually signed away your ability to sue. So this legislation gets rid of all of that and also engenders training, statewide training for all employees of organizations working in California, not just higher echelon. So imagine having like this room full of people. Say if all of you had undergone sexual harassment training and then somebody in this room got harassed by someone else, you'd have this community of people who knew what to do about it. And there's something called bystander intervention training, which is explicitly mentioned in this legislation, so that you would have a pathway to help, a pathway to become a force to be reckoned with, and to stop this atmosphere of impunity, which we see Hollywood power brokers and people in every other industry have been enjoying basically forever. The medical industry, academia, corporate culture, politics, everywhere this happens, there are victims everywhere. And although, yes, men are the majority of the perpetrators, the victims are certainly not all women. And some of the perpetrators are female too. But we're so excited because these 3 bills have just passed all of the California legislation. I was literally on the phone with all of these offices over the last few weeks, calling them and being like, please let me tell you why we, the survivors, support this legislation. And you may say, well, it's one state, but California is home to 12% of America's women, of the United States' women, and our legislation is often copied by other states and even other countries. So we see this as something that we could have spread like wildfire, and we are now so excited because perhaps Governor Jerry Brown will make this his legacy impact statement by basically being very pro-women, pro-worker, anti-sexual harassment, anti-discrimination, pro-equality, and sign these 3 bills into law in the next couple of weeks. So we're counting on you, Governor Jerry Brown. Everyone here is listening. Let's all tweet about it. So for me to see that happen when I saw these 3 bills get passed by all of the senators and committees and everything, I was like, wow, we're doing something. We're achieving something tangible. We are not just outcrying, which is great, and I love seeing, people being exposed and losing their power from their abuses of it. But I want to prevent it from happening in the first place.
Right, and it's incumbent on everybody to let people know that this legislation is in the offing, as you say, tweet about it.
Yes.
And for HR departments to feel empowered, so when people go to them complaining about it, they don't shush them up. Amber, I want to bring you in here. You've also been a very active member of Time's Up and Me Too. You were harassed, tried to bring it to people's attention, and no one took any notice, right? Do you think it's easier for people to talk out now, to speak up now?
Yeah, I just believe so much in everything that Mira just said, as far as, there has to be action behind the activism, that there has to be some sort of proactive trajectory that we're all on behind the anger. I've often described it, especially women right now are sort of are in this combined conversation of being angry and organized. So they're angrenized, I call them. and I think that some of the most profound change is happening right now, but still that there's not enough. And part of it always goes back to this abuse of power, and that the Me Too movement ultimately was about exactly that, is about not just sexual harassment and sexual assault, but also just people who are in positions of power that abuse it and that keep others marginalized or held down or not allowed into those rooms, and ultimately boxed out of conversations creatively and otherwise in which they absolutely have the right to exist. I think one of the best examples that I just saw, which stirred up so much emotion in me, so I can't even possibly imagine how much emotion it stirred up in black women, certainly in America, but is watching this recent match with Serena Williams, which was just, for most women that I know, I had a woman who worked at Fox for a very, very long time, very powerful woman who created a very famous television show, text me about it to just say that is every experience that a woman has ever had when she is frustrated or angry in a room and she's expressing herself in her God-given right to emotionally express herself, is to say, don't do that, because no one wants to listen to anything other than rational thought, and that there is no space in this world for emotional communication, for emotional intelligence. And I think that experience, watching it from me and watching it from my friend, brought back so much of that sense of like, you know, me calling out an actor and saying he tried to pick me up at 16 had nothing to do with that necessarily. It had to do with all of the James Woods, all of the ones that are like him, that sit in positions of power, that sit in verbal states of authority and authoritative positions and act as though they are the arbiters of what should or shouldn't be done, what consequences should or shouldn't be given to somebody. And my frustration with that has always just been the deferment and looking at women and saying, this is so important that we level the playing field, that there is equality, not just in the workplace, but in every aspect of our daily lives, in the conversations that we're having, that we have to keep remembering that the power is within all of us to have those conversations, and we all have to hold our own selves accountable as far as saying, what am I doing, not just to help, but what am I doing to harm? That's the thing that I know I ask myself on a daily basis.
Do you, as both founder members of Time's Up and of Me Too, what do you think about CBS saying they want to give 20 million to the Me Too movement? Do you see that as them looking for air cover, given that this has taken 4 weeks since Ronan Farrow's original piece about Les Moonves?
I think it's a good first step, but that's not how he gets out of trouble. He has to be pursued through the criminal justice system, just as Harvey Weinstein is being pursued. There have to be real consequences. Rich people don't get a get-out-of-jail-free card. Not anymore. That's not, you know, it's time to really achieve justice for victims. So, great, that 20 million, it's not million, it's not billion, it's million, right? Yeah.
It's 20 million.
Yes.
Yeah, 20 million.
That should help if it goes to the Legal Defense Fund.
Yeah.
But his individual victims that have been named in these articles, I don't think they're getting any of that money. So where's their justice? There still has to be justice, restorative justice for them. I want to see one of these guys own it. That's all. I want to see just one of them own their bullshit.
Okay, so that's
own it.
Great note.
I get tired of hearing the excuses. I get tired of the victimization, of the feeling sorry for themselves, of coming out and telling jokes about rape whistles and not even mentioning anything about something and pain that you have physically inflicted on another person. And I think that this is what I mean when I say that I wish there was self-policing by men and by communities, women too, who are in positions of power and abuse that. But what they don't seem to understand is that this healing can only happen if we are really having those transparent conversations. And the transparency is not just about us telling our stories and coming out here and putting ourselves on the line every single day. It's about men stepping over their own comfort line and saying, I did this. Not only do I do this, I see this every day in the workplace with men I work with, and I'm calling them out, and I'm going to speak to it, and I'm going to help move that along so that it's not just on the burden of somebody else, predominantly women, to do it.
Okay, so let me bring in Michael here, and I feel unfortunately you've now got to answer on behalf of all men everywhere. But there was one very interesting moment recently. Louis C.K., the comedian who, well, you all know what Louis C.K. did, right? I don't need to go back through that, but you tweeted saying that you noticed he was back out and that you were happy for him. And then Twitter sort of exploded at you and you were forced to sort of retreat. Can you talk a little bit about the notion of redemption for these men?
Yeah, well, you're slightly mischaracterizing what I said. I did not say I was happy to see him back. I said I was happy to see him try. And there were a lot of complicated reasons for that, why I wrote that. Ultimately, it was a mistake on my part and I'm not going to sort of relitigate my own case against myself, but I apologized a lot. And I think Amber's right that the question that you just asked, when am I doing harm and when am I helping? I think that's an important question. In my case, the mistake I made was actually believing that I was helping a conversation and in fact was causing harm by trying to have that conversation. And it wasn't about redemption for me in terms of Louis. It was about the idea that you were just touching on, about how for men who are accused and, in Louis' case, admit to doing these things, how do we place them on a spectrum? Because there is a spectrum. How do they address their own lives moving forward when they're not subject to the criminal justice system? And you may be right that they should be. But in Louis' case specifically, and I kind of picked him because he was so sort of imperfect, because he's somebody who is maybe irredeemably flawed and maybe redeemably flawed, but he's not a guy who you look at and can say he has publicly gone on the apology tour or done rehab or done any of those things in public. But is he irredeemable?
Well,
please.
A friend of mine, Maureen Herman, a journalist and former musician, an amazing person, wrote a really fascinating article exactly about Louis C.K.
I tweeted it.
Okay, it's really fascinating because she talks about, she felt, was it too soon? Yes, it's too soon, because he has done none of these things to signal to the audience at large, not just the audience in that room that night that didn't ask to see him. So it offended a lot of women in the audience, and a lot of men loved that he was back. But that you can't undo what you did. He cannot take back those moments where he arguably psychically scarred those women forever with that situation. But he could show devotion to the cause of righting those wrongs in the future. She spoke about Klansmen who were no longer, who had a kind of come to Jesus moment, were no longer racist and now tried to train other bigots to not be racist. She spoke about drunk drivers who had killed people who now devote all their spare time to going to AA meetings and informing fellow people struggling with addiction how her actions had irrevocably taken the life of another person. So that there was a sum total contribution to society after the takeaway with his former actions. He has shown none of that, and it's as though he just expects, well, I've been out of it for a little while. But one of the things she said, it's not called, oh God, what? It's not called time out. It's called time's up. So it's not like you get a timeout. Okay, you spend 40 minutes in your bedroom, young man.
You know what?
All right. So if you see a person who has genuinely positive feelings,
but the fact that he also didn't say anything in this set that he came out, the fact
and he
that
made a rape whistle joke. How offensive!
But it just tells me he didn't go do the work. So you spent a year doing what? Like sulking, rewatching your movies. I don't know what he was doing. But when you have that time, and I understand, maybe that was not, these things need to be taught in all of us, right? We all need to learn how to change and grow, and that maybe even a Louis C.K. needs someone in his life to help him see how he was part of the problem in that moment, and that there was a real space for him to be able to come, and there probably still will be, to go do stand-up and to be able to talk about those things.
All
but
right.
he didn't in that moment.
I want to bring Amanda in here. You're a broadcaster. You worked at CBC, where, of course, there was a famous Me Too scandal. And you've also worked in the music business. How similar is this debate that we're having in America going on in Canada?
Well, I didn't work in the music business per se, but I was kind of aligned closely to it. I mean, I don't think this conversation is one that's defined by borders or nations. It's something that exists everywhere. Patriarchy is something that exists everywhere. Misogyny is something that exists everywhere. And women throughout the world have been in danger for a very long time, and so have some men. In Canada, we've been engaging in this conversation in a public way a little bit before there was ever something called Me Too or Time's Up, partly because of that case that you mentioned with Jian Ghomeshi. And it was a conversation that played out in the public and forced us to think about how these stories are written, the responsibility of reporters, how they are framed, who gets to speak, who is centered in these conversations, and then how it plays out in the criminal justice system. So, I mean, I think, you know, the desire to see these things tried in court makes sense on paper, but what if the court system is flawed? What if the court system doesn't necessarily have, what if the court system doesn't have a good history of dealing with these things either? What if the court system has been structured in such a way that does still privilege the voices of men, the perspectives and stories of men, or the defense of men? And so I think this is something that we've been grappling with for some time, and the fact that it kind of exploded in the United States in this particular way just gave us another frame for it and more connections to talk about this issue in general, but this issue particularly when it comes to men who have a ridiculous amount of power, and a power that goes unchecked in so many ways and gets normalized in so many ways. And then what does that play out into in day-to-day interactions, and how does that play out into the ways that other people's opportunities are limited, and the ways that other people become threatened and silenced by that power.
And that power also, I think it's worth pointing out, in Les Moonves' situation, gets enormously rewarded financially too.
Of course.
And it's quite astonishing, the idea that he was sitting there negotiating for the last few weeks his enormous payout. So let me ask you all, because we've got time just for one brief final answer, and as you know, this conversation could go on for weeks, and undoubtedly it will go on for many months. But let me ask you all, what do you hope for next steps to be? And Amber, I'm going to start with you and then have everybody do a lightning round to the end.
My hope is that more men take the lead of a Michael Ian Black, who is someone who I've admired a very long time for his work. Huge Stella fan. But this idea to be able to take ownership of the mistake and to look at it and go, I don't want to hurt, I don't want to harm, I want to help. And ultimately for more men to police themselves so that we all don't have to do it.
Fair enough.
You know, there's all of these incredible programs that are working with youth right now. And I think that's where the future lies, because you have to get to people early to get kids to understand, first of all, what their boundaries are, what they are able to say no to, what their rights are. But secondly, to raise a culture of men that does not have this enormous pressure to constantly score, to test their masculinity by how many people they've banged, rather than having mutual respect and meaningful relationships. What a concept. But the idea that, you know, when we think of our pop culture, and I've brought this up before, but there was a John Hughes movie in which the nerdy guy is obsessed with the pretty girlfriend of the high school football player. And he goes to a party, and he's like, Molly Ringwald's in love with him, and his girlfriend is drunk in a room, and he's like, you know what, I don't want to have her, you can have her. And so the nerdy boy picks up the drunk girlfriend, puts him in his convertible, and she is incoherent. She is incapable of any kind of consent. He is so excited, she falls into his lap, face down onto his lap. He's elated. Cut to, he dumps her on her front porch. He has now lost his virginity, and yay, he's now a man. And that is the kind of culture that our culture has told men, this is being a man's son. You know, get a stripper for your, your night before you're getting married. Go to a whorehouse to celebrate your coming of age. Fraternities, like having these parties and, just kind of how many people did you score with? And I spoke to a young man the other day who had just graduated from an Ivy League institution. He said everybody there is very worried because they feel like now anything they do is going to be taken out of context and they're going to be accused of improprieties. And I said, well, if you really look at women empathetically and you really do ask affirmatively for consent, you just have to be like, are you okay with this? Is this something you want to do? And he said, well, there's such a thing, though, as physical consent, nonverbal consent. And I was like, that won't cut it in this day and age. You really have to ask people, is this something you want to do? And if they say no, okay, sex is over, but that way you're not a bad person. And we have to think of, you know, I think it's been compartmentalized. Good men in so many other arenas have had this Lothario side, this side of conquerors of women and marauders in a way. And I think we have to bring those two things back together and say, no, you are one whole person. You have to be good and empathetic in every area of your life, and that will only strengthen you as a man. It's not going to diminish.
All right, Michael, apart from buying a copy of your book, A Better Man, what, quickly, what do you hope for next steps?
So you're asking a question that I think Mira actually just answered beautifully. And I'm thinking and writing a lot about this in terms of next steps, next immediate steps in terms of what this conversation has been about. I think it has to be for guys to not just hear what women are saying, but really listen and process. And right now, I think a lot of men are in a very defensive crouch. And you have to, as a guy, be okay in that discomfort, because it is uncomfortable.
Yeah. All right, Amanda, very final word to you, and then we have to scarper.
3 things. One thing a friend, Marlon Palmer, said at a profile on a panel that we were on recently. As a man, he's seen this the way white people should see conversations around racism. As soon as someone accuses them and lets them know that they have been racist, the immediate thing is defensiveness, and then hopefully they'll start to listen. And once he recognized it in that way, he said, oh, as a young black man, I don't want to be that stupid racist white person that doesn't think that they're racist, so let me just listen and check myself. 2, we need sex ed curriculum that is going to teach our children how to protect themselves, how to defend themselves, how to understand, to have the resources and the tools to do all of those things. And in Ontario, we need it right now, not any time later. And then the final thing, for all of my peers in journalism, that we frame these stories in ways that are responsible, that have nuance, that understand texture, and recognize that when we're putting the story out there, we are doing a huge disservice when we write it simplistically.
Okay, Amanda Parris, Michael Ian Black, Mira Sorvino, Amber Tamblyn, thank you very much.
Thank you.